Tonight on Primetime Politics, ensuring Indigenous consultation.
We support growth and prosperity for all, but not at the expense of our rights and the government's obligations to First Nations.
A special gathering of the AFN chiefs ends with a clear message to Ottawa. Major projects will not happen without the consent and buy-in of First Nation leadership. Does the federal government need to revisit how it proceeds with national projects? We'll speak to our political strategists. And polls analysts Éric Grenier and Philippe Fournier on what Canadians are saying about that MOU signed between Ottawa and the Alberta government. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. A special gathering of chiefs organized by the Assembly of First Nations this week came to a close in Ottawa today with these words from the organization's national chief, Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak.
Listening to the discussions this week, we're also reminded that even though our rights are being threatened today in new ways, First Nations across this country are stronger than we have ever been. First Nations have overcome great odds to protect our rights, our lands, our laws, our resources, and our waters. First Nations stand with Canada against provincial separatists that want to break this beautiful country apart. We support growth and prosperity for all, but not at the expense of our rights and the government's obligations to First Nations.
And to that, one key issue that came up time and time again this week, that memorandum of understanding signed between Ottawa and the Alberta government last Thursday. That MOU prioritizes the building of at least one new pipeline, and if Premier Danielle Smith has her way, it would be a pipeline through northern British Columbia. But as it stands, even the idea of that project is opposed by BC coastal chiefs, opposition that was reflected at the AFN meeting this week, leading delegates to ask government ministers if they were committed to Indigenous consultation. Here's how some ministers answered that very pointed question.
We're legally required there's the duty to consult and accommodate, and the government will be doing that.
It's enshrined in the guiding principle of the Major Project Office. The Major Project Office is there to facilitate on the basis of what is law in Canada.
This investment strategy, for it to succeed, is not only about attracting capital, it's also making sure that a project can be executed, and part of that really speaks to social acceptability.
Well, with more on the questions being asked by delegates at the AFN and the MOU itself, we're now joined by our political strategist. Susan Smith is a Liberal strategist, principal and co-founder of Blue Sky Strategy Group. Cole Hogan is a Conservative strategist, and George Soule is a former NDP Director of Communications, now principal and founder of On Step Strategies. Hello to the three of you.
Hello.
Hello. So listen, let's begin here with what we heard today, these ongoing questions about the government and ultimately its commitment to getting consultation with First Nations. How big of a misstep was it to move forward with this MOU without getting buy-in from Indigenous leadership in the first place, in particular from the BC coastal chiefs? So George, I'll get you to start us out.
Well, I think it's a big mistake, and I think that we saw that with Minister Miller admitting that immediately after joining cabinet and saying that they should have been negotiating all along. I think if you were actually serious about this project, that's the only way it's ever going to get built. In the absence of the support from the coastal First Nations, the project's not going to happen. I think the Prime Minister knows that, and I think that's the kind of language he uses when he's here in Ottawa. Don't worry, there's no project, it's going to be fine. But we saw him in Alberta getting 2 standing ovations from the Chamber of Commerce of Alberta, which you only get, or in Calgary, which you only get if you are going to deliver a pipeline. So it's this double messaging that's been really, I think, it worked in the very short term for the Prime Minister and for the government, but in the long term, they're going to get caught up in the 2 different messages they're sending. Yeah,
Susan, a misstep here?
I think they probably should have done some reach out beforehand. It's hard to explain a process for people. There's no short way to do it, and especially if it's not an answer that people want. The pro-pipeline proponents want this is the fastest way to yes. The anti-pipeline proponents want this is the fastest way to no. There's legislation, there's a process, there's stakeholders that have to be consulted. It includes First Nations. I was at the AFN Special Chiefs Assembly this week. I heard the Prime Minister answering questions. He's definitely committed to First Nations consultation. I think they could have started off on a better foot there, but he was committed to the discussions. I think they'll be ongoing, and that's what this whole major projects process is about. It's not a guaranteed yes, it's not a guaranteed no. It's a can we build things faster and better, but not without talking to the people we need to talk to.
Cole?
Sure. So I think that there is a few things of note here. Like, I think obviously things could have been done a little bit differently. From the federal side, I've seen the government of Alberta and their Indigenous Affairs Minister already engaging on a lot of these issues. But I think it's important to note too, like, Indigenous thought is not a monolith. All Indigenous people don't think the same. And we've seen, you know, a majority of support in multiple provinces across the country for pipeline projects, given the dire economic straits that we're in. Yesterday, we saw Métis Settlements of Alberta say that they would like to purchase a stake in this pipeline project. We saw Danielle Smith say that up to 50% of this pipeline project could be Indigenous owned. So I think while things might have started off on the wrong foot, I think the provincial government and the federal government are engaging in good faith.
Okay, well, let's pick up on that point, though, because I do wonder, how do you then try to right this ship? If people feel like this was off course to begin with, how do you actually right the ship strategically? Susan?
I think conversation and dialogue, not on Zoom, is the way to do it. I'm not sure the Alberta government has started out exactly the greatest way. They've got sort of their Alberta people, they're dropping into BC communities. I think it's important for people to understand who they are speaking with, though, too, and who speaks on behalf of whom. Are you speaking to an elected chief, or is the person who's purporting to represent many voices, do they have an elected mandate in that particular case? Individual communities will have an opportunity. I've talked to coastal First Nations leaders, small coastal capital First Nations leaders, who are open to the conversation about innovation and talking about difference in technology for tankers and GPS, but the pressure, the social and public pressure around even putting your hand up to say, could we at least think about this kind of conversation in a public way, is really holding them back. So I think the governments plural, that's Alberta, BC, and the feds, working with nation governments, having those conversations face-to-face is really important. Well, BC will have to be part of the conversation. I mean, for them not to be part, they have to be at the table going forward. They have a say from a stakeholder consultation perspective under the legislation. So they have to find something that works, or they have to figure out that it's not going to work. I don't think anybody's going to throw in the towel at this stage of the game. And as everybody's pointed out, right now the proponent for this is Danielle Smith and the government of Alberta for the first $14 million part of things. It costs a lot more than $14 million to buy a pipeline or build a pipeline. And it's unlikely, you need a private sector proponent to be able to do that.
Yeah. George, how do you right the ship?
Well, I think it's hard now, the path they've gone down, to be honest. Like, I think they wanted the announcement, right? So you had Mark Carney standing next to Danielle Smith with a big smile on their face in Calgary, getting the standing ovations and having all those accolades, but again, hadn't done the difficult work to move forward. I mean, you know, Stephen Harper taught us the lesson of trying to jam these things through means you get nothing built. And that, I think, is the lesson that the Liberals should have learned already and now have to relearn. They also need to figure out what they want to do. Like, they're trying to play both sides of this, and it's too complicated and too difficult an issue to dance on both sides of the issue, I think. And I think they need to figure that out. They can't keep celebrating the fact they're announcing big projects and try to defend them by saying, don't worry, they're not going to get built in the first place.
Cole?
Yeah, the conversation is shifting too, because we've seen some bits and pieces here. Christy Clark recently said that there are tankers carrying oil from Alaska all down the west coast on a regular basis, so that's a part of the conversation. David Eby seems to even have shifted his language on this project, and Alberta, obviously, in its relationship with the federal government, is looking to see some quicker movement on this stuff. But what I'm looking at as well is, you know, Stephen Guilbeault criticized the project and said he doesn't think it's going to happen. We've seen some BC Liberal MPs in Carney's caucus say that they don't think this project's ever going to happen. There's a lot of, you know, disparate, different voices speaking at the same time. So who are we to believe here? The BC Liberal MPs who say it'll never happen, or the Prime Minister and his cabinet who appear to want it to happen? And at the end of all of this, the pipeline, it's an interprovincial pipeline project. It's federal jurisdiction. So the federal government has the last call on this. So will they honor that responsibility, or will they run away from him?
Yeah, well, you sound like you don't want it to happen, actually, which is kind of how the Conservatives have been talking, right? They've been screaming and yelling and hollering and stamping their feet for another pipeline, yet they can't get on board behind the process, and they're criticizing the process. To make change in the country, you have to be able to have conversations with people. You have to do things better, which is what this C5 legislation is. If you can have one environmental assessment that looks at, rather than duplicative, I think everybody knows it makes sense. You go to the doctor once or twice. You go once, you get your report, and you move forward from that if it's just your regular checkup. So I think it's important to allow the process to take place. The government is trying to do something new, trying to do something different. There will be yeses and there will be nos at the end, but you can't write it off right from the get-go. Of course there are two voices.
There are two voices within the Liberal caucus.
Okay, but there's
two voices within Mark Carney's head. That's the biggest problem. Mark Carney himself is making two different announcements. Is the epitome, I said this the other day, he's the epitome of him, of saying two things in two different places. And the problem is there are video cameras in both places. If you watch what he said in Calgary, it's this thing's getting built. We're building this pipeline. Here we go. High five, Daniel Smith.
Here's the process.
Who, by the way, it's also a premier who is destroying public health care in this country, using notwithstanding clause to attack trans kids, using notwithstanding clause to attack workers and teachers, and the Prime Minister is shaking her hand over an imaginary project. And that's another problem we have to deal with separately, I think. But then meanwhile, he comes back to Ottawa, and when attacked by environmentalists, or when rightfully pushed back by the First Nations who control the land on the coast, he says, no, we're nowhere near making the pipeline. We're just open to the idea now. And so those two positions, held by one person who is the Prime Minister, is what's causing this conflict. It's why there's so much confusion within the cabinet, because the person at the top isn't clear, and I think it's intentional.
I don't think there's confusion in cabinet. I don't think there's confusion at the top. There's a process in place to be able to get major projects done in this country on the East Coast and the West Coast and in between, whether it's rail, whether it's ports, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's a pipeline. There is no project that has been green lit yet, but there's a process to try and do things differently in this country, and that's what Canadians wanted. They said, quit doing it the same old way and don't always be about no. Let's be about how we can get to a green light if we have enough people who can agree to it. And I think we have to let the process get going.
Well, except when people are being asked the question, they're not being asked, do you support the process? They're asking, do you support pipelines being built? So it's actually more clear for Canadians about a pipeline than just a process.
Yeah, and there are many different opinions on should there be a pipeline built. It depends on where you are in the country. And so to expect 100% acquiescence or 100% support for anything in Canada is impossible. You can't get it on what should we have for dinner tonight at your own family dinner table. You're not going to get it when it comes to regional disparities. But you have to find a way to make the path, to create a path to make the best decision for the country. And the way we were doing it before only got one pipeline built and didn't get any mines going fast enough. So is there a way to get to it in a better, safer, environmentally friendly way where Indigenous people have an equity opportunity in a project? I think that's what this government is trying to do. And I think it's important that the opposition see the nation building opportunities that are presented rather than complaining about it.
Quickly running time, some last closing thoughts to either of you?
Quickly on that last point, there is actually a path, and there is one, the one pipeline that was built is not a capacity. So even if we were talking about trying to get more resources to our customers, which you have two debates on that one as well, but a pipeline exists that's got capacity in it that we should be first filling up before we're talking about trying to blast another pipeline through land that people don't want it to go through.
That's why the NDP, that's not, sometimes you have to do two things at once, and you have to contemplate
Let's start with
forward.
the easy one and then move to the harder one.
Okay, Cole, last word to you.
This is what happens when the Liberal Party tries to do two things at once. Like, they're going to try to say that they are pro-energy, and look, Daniel Smith and the Alberta government got a lot of concessions out of the federal government here, but it remains to be seen, especially with internal caucus debates. Like, there's a lot of people in the Liberal caucus who don't like the direction that Mark Carney's taking the Liberal Party in, the amorphous, ephemeral, ideological cluster that it is. So we'll see if these people having elected Mark Carney, do they actually like the policies that he puts in place?
Okay. I remind you there's a green room if you want to continue the conversation.
You can't talk about the floor crossing from the Conservatives underbelly. Yep, come on!
Susan, Cole, George, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as I hinted to earlier, there have been some early polling numbers on that memorandum of understanding itself. And with a look at the MOU and how Canadians are responding to it, let's bring in right now Éric, the founder and the writer of the Writ, Philippe, the founder and the writer of 338 Canada. Hello to both of you.
Hi, Michael.
Good evening, Michael.
So listen, this MOU has been described as a political gamble for the Carney government. So first off, with some quick impressions, is this gamble paying off for the Prime Minister? Éric, I'll get you to start us out.
Well, I think that the thing we can say the most is that so far the gamble is not hurting him. It is still very early on in terms of the public opinion environment, and whether Canadians are reacting positively or negatively to it. We haven't seen much movement in the polls. When it has been polling that has been asking specifically about a pipeline, about the MOU in particular, we do see that there is pretty broad support for it across the country, including in British Columbia. But whether or not it is going to have longer-term impacts, whether it will, in the longer term, be a good thing for the Liberals, I think will depend primarily on how it unfolds and how things go over the next few months and really the next few years.
Okay, how it unfolds and where it goes. But, you know, Philippe, I'll get you into this right now because it seems to do, when you look at the numbers, there does seem to be some early weakness, particularly in Metro Vancouver.
That is correct. The Angus Reid Institute had some fresh numbers post-MOU, and we saw that even though Mr. Carney himself, his personal numbers did not move, there was a slippage in Liberal support, specifically in Metro Vancouver. I have the numbers right here. They went from 55% to 39%. And so these numbers can be very worrying for the Liberals because the bulk of their seat in British Columbia naturally is in Metro Vancouver. But as Éric said, it is way too early. There are many conditions. Perhaps this pipeline will never see the day. Perhaps this pipeline will take years or even decades to be built. But as far as a gamble, it looks so far like the Liberals are doing fine with it. But it's be very interesting to see early in the year what it does.
Yeah, what it does. And, you know, when we talk about Metro Vancouver, Éric, I think part of the calculus people are trying to figure out is in British Columbia, Liberals have 20 seats. In Alberta, they have 2 seats. If they were to lose in British Columbia, could they make that up in Alberta, is a question being asked.
Yeah, and it seems unlikely. I mean, there was only really 3 seats that the Liberals came pretty close to winning in Alberta, so they would need to see a big jump in Alberta to win those 3 seats. We actually might get a test of that in Edmonton Riverbend when that by-election takes place, whenever it does. But there's so many more seats in the BC Lower Mainland where the Liberals did not win by a large margin, so it wouldn't take much of a drop in support for them to lose those seats. I do think, though, that the calculation is not just about those 20 BC seats and those 2 Alberta seats. It is about what it's going to do nationwide. We did see polling from Abacus Data, for example, asking whether this was a good deal, showing compromise, or whether it was betrayal of the government's past environmental policies. And we saw that there was majority support for the idea that this was a good deal, that this was a good compromise to make, especially in Ontario. So I think that there is the potential that even if this could end up costing them a couple seats in British Columbia, does it actually help Mark Carney's economic reputation in the rest of the country, where maybe it'll matter more?
Matter more. Although I do wonder about the impact of Stephen Guilbeault, because of course here you have a high-profile cabinet minister who has resigned his position in the Carney government over this MOU, and the question is, Philippe, as to the impact of that, particularly in Quebec.
Well, so far the impact seems to be limited. I mean, Monsieur Guilbeault, of course, has been in cabinet for many years, and he's well known in Quebec. But when we look at the polling, we see that a good chunk of Quebecers really don't have an opinion on the man. Abacus Data had numbers on this recently in Quebec, where we see that about a quarter of Quebecers had a good opinion of Monsieur Guilbeault, and 19% had a bad opinion of Monsieur Guilbeault. And so, and in the same poll, we see that Mark Carney has a plus 25 net favorability rating in Quebec. And this is post-MOU. So perhaps, I don't want to overplay Monsieur Guilbeault, of course, I don't want to downplay it either, but so far the effect on Quebec voters appears to be very limited. And again, to go back to the Angus Reid Institute poll, yes, the numbers on pipelines are tighter in Quebec, but it was 49% of Quebec respondents that said they were in favor of this deal. So the impact could be limited.
Yeah, limited, and I think that's kind of the summation at this point. 7 days into the signing of this MOU, the vast majority of the country does seem to be on side, and there are criticisms around it with the environment. So we'll see, and also consultation, I should add. But we'll see where that goes, as both of you are saying. But while you're here, I also want to talk about Quebec right now, not federally, but provincially, because, you know, we're about 2 weeks now from when the Quebec Liberal leader, Pablo Rodriguez, dropped his parliamentary leader for firing her chief of staff, who, by the by, is a friend of Pablo Rodriguez. And then the Journal de Montréal published that report that suggests there was a vote-buying scheme attached to Mr. Rodriguez's leadership campaign, an allegation that's now being investigated. But what's been the impact of that, given how close we are now to a Quebec vote, Éric?
Well, it has been a big impact because just before that news broke, we were starting to see some polls where the Parti Québécois numbers were coming down a little bit. The Liberals were inching up a little bit. Because of the PQ's lead among Francophones, it didn't really mean that the PQ was on track to lose an election, but it did suggest that maybe this was going to be a lot closer than we had thought. Then we've seen these stories come out. Philippe can get into the numbers perhaps a bit more in more detail, but we've seen support for the Liberal Party drop. We've seen support for Pablo Rodriguez drop big time. And he's just an opposition leader who's been there for a few months, and he already has numbers that look like he's a 10-year-old government and people are ready to kick him out. So I think it is a real dangerous position for the Quebec Liberals, and the next election is only 10 months away.
Yeah, absolutely. You're nodding your head very strongly there, Philippe.
Well, it's because we were lucky to have polls at the right moment, right? The Palace data poll published with L'Actualité was at the beginning of this implosion for the Quebec Liberals, and it showed that the Liberal brand was doing okay, 25% in voting intentions, roughly the average of what the party had in the past year. However, Monsieur Rodriguez's personal numbers, as Éric alluded to, completely tanked. In one quarter, we saw is unfavorable go up 15 points, and his favorables going down 10 points. That's a swing of 25 points in one quarter, and so we know why that is. And then we had Léger earlier this week that showed that the story are even hurting now the Quebec Liberal brand. Liberals are at 21% voting intentions, only 10% among Francophones, and so right now, if the numbers we have right now translated to the ballot box next October, we would have a huge majority for the Parti Québécois with 39% of the vote.
Yeah, and to that, important to note here, while the Liberal numbers, provincial numbers, are slipping under Pablo Rodriguez, the gain of that is to the Parti Québécois, not to the CAQ.
Well, yes, the CAQ have their own problems over there. 18% in that Léger poll, and Monsieur Legault, the Premier, has a 75% unfavorable rating according to the Palace data poll. And so it looks like the CAQ will have a really steep hill to come back into this race next year.
Yeah, and any last word there, Éric, before we go?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I guess you could say if you're wondering if this election is already done, I mean, Pierre Poilievre did have a 20-point lead only a few months before the election. I'm not sure if there was a Mark Carney waiting in the wings somewhere in Quebec politics, but if there was an election held today, as Philippe said, no doubt that the PQ would win, and obviously that would open up a whole new political discussion in Canada for the next few years.
Well, certainly people are talking more about sovereignty in Ottawa as well, a possibility of that vote in Quebec. But not to get ahead of myself, Éric and Philippe, for today, thank you very much. Thank you for the discussion.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, before we go tonight, we do want to acknowledge the upcoming anniversary of the mass shooting at Montreal's École Polytechnique. Saturday will mark 36 years since that horrible day when a shooter entered an engineering class at the school, ordered the men to leave, and then opened fire on the women who remained. Today, federal MPs, they paid tribute to the women, and we wanted to share some of those words with you tonight.
Gender-based violence is not a chapter of our past. It is a persistent and pervasive reality in Canada. It remains woven into the story of our country, and it demands urgent action. So today, we recommit ourselves to this work, Mr. Speaker. We stand with survivors, we honor their strength, and we ensure their voices and stories are never forgotten. but champion as we continue to fight for change, for equality, and for justice.
Moi, vous allez me permettre, Monsieur le Président, de nommer les femmes qui sont tombées ce soir-là, pour que jamais on oublie qui elles étaient. Geneviève Bergeron, Hélène Colgan, Nathalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Edward, Maude Aviernik, Barbara Kluznik, Wedad Vigic, en espérant bien le prononcer, Maryse Laganière, Maryse Leclerc, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, Michel Richard, Annie Saint-Arnaud et Annie Turcotte, Monsieur le Président. Ces femmes-là n'ont pas eu d'avenir. Parce qu'un homme, un jour, a décidé que les femmes, elles étaient trop, surtout dans des corps de métier comme l'ingénierie.
Vous, les femmes qui nous avaient été arrachées le 6 décembre 89, vous continuez, après toutes ces années, à unir des Québécoises et des Québécois qui veulent en finir avec la misogynie et la violence à l'égard des femmes. Vous êtes devenus un phare qui nous guide quand on ne sait plus où aller. Nous avons eu des gains en votre nom, nous avons eu des reculs et d'amères défaites malgré votre souvenir, mais nous gardons le cap.
To the women of École Polytechnique, it's to honor all women who face violence. And to honor all women is to confront the specific violence faced by Indigenous women and girls and diverse Indigenous peoples. These truths do not compete. They reinforce one another. One teaches us the cost of misogyny. The other shows us what happens when misogyny is multiplied by racism, by colonial history, and by state neglect. Both demand that we act with urgency and courage. Mr. Speaker, the response must be full and determined as the sorrow we carry. We honor 14 women murdered at École Polytechnique by refusing to accept violence as inevitable.
It's not easy to figure out how to solve misogyny. It's horrific. But if we keep our hearts open and we keep a commitment to act and we thank each other when we're unified as we are today, we'll find our way. But we must be committed, each one of us today, regardless of party, to say we won't rest until violence against women ends.
And Saturday, December the 6th, will mark 36 years since that horrific day. That is Primetime Politics for this Thursday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We are back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.